Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Americans for Peace Now webinar. I'm Ori Nir. I just went through my comments for the podcast, and the intro is a little long, so just bear with me. Um, Before we start, our two usual housekeeping comments. This webinar is recorded. The video will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and the audio will become an episode on our podcast, Peacecast. The other comment is that you're welcome to ask questions, and to do that, please use the Q&A tool that's on the bottom of your screen. Please keep your questions short. I go through them as we speak, so long questions are difficult to screen. And you can start posting questions right now. I'm happy to see many people joining us. And I know that many of you registered also for the webinar that we will have on Tuesday, January 23rd, next Tuesday, with Rabbi Sharon Brous. The conversation with Rabbi Brous will be, I think, a good opportunity for people to discuss how we process the hard times that we've all been experiencing in the past 3 months. And I'm looking forward to it. Today, we're going to discuss an important aspect of this crisis that we've been following with heavy hearts, obviously, since October 7th. We will discuss the Palestinian perspective on the future of the Gaza Strip and more broadly, the impact of the current crisis on Palestinian politics and the Palestinian arena. You were originally invited to hear Zaha Hassan, who's a scholar at Washington's Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Zaha couldn't make it. She asked me to apologize on her behalf and generously offered to reschedule, and we will do so hopefully very soon. Thankfully, in short notice, another Washington-based scholar of Palestinian affairs, Khaled Elgindy, agreed to join us today and share his analysis with us on this topic. Khaled is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute here in Washington, and he's also the director of the Middle East Institute's program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. He is the author of Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians. It's a history of 100 years or so of U.S. policy on Palestine and the Palestinians. I actually read the book and I recommend it warmly. Some of you may remember that when the book came out about 4 years ago or so, we hosted Khaled on our podcast for a conversation on the book. And just to complete Khaled's bio, before joining the Middle East Institute, he was a fellow at the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. And before that, he served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on permanent status issue negotiations with Israel. I don't expect to agree with everything that Khaled will say. You may also take issue with some of what he has to say, but as we always point out, we're here to learn, to hear a variety of views and perspectives, and we're grateful to our guests for sharing their views and wisdom with us, particularly when they do it in such short notice as Khaled is doing today. So, with this long introduction, Khaled, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I wanted to start by referring to an expression that you used in a recent Foreign Affairs article, where you wrote about the current crisis as a cataclysmic event in Palestinian history. You described the situation in the Gaza Strip, as well as the political disarray in the Palestinian arena. Add to it the economic crisis in the West Bank and the possibility of a violent eruption in the West Bank. The question is, before we discuss the proverbial day after, which is the topic of our conversation today, can the Palestinians at all arrive at the day after in any reasonable shape to function as a collective?
Yeah, I mean, this is the million-dollar question that everybody's asking. So before getting into the day after discussion, such as it is, I think it's important to put in perspective what's happening in Gaza now. I think it's impossible to overstate the scale and significance of the ongoing catastrophe in Gaza. I think it is on a par with, and in many ways even surpasses, um, 1948 and 1967 for Palestinians. Of course, 1948 being the Nakba, the catastrophe that kind of defined everything that came after and that shaped Palestinian political consciousness. What's happening now is, I think, is in many ways surpasses that. It is the deadliest event in Palestinian history, the deadliest single event. At least between 25 and 30,000 have been killed already. We know there's another 8,000 or so buried under the rubble, so that number is very much tentative. At least 10,000 children, 1.9 million people internally displaced, repeatedly displaced, particularly in the south. They're constantly being moved. Many have been moved 5, 6, 7 times in the last 3 months. Um, and this is the largest forced displacement in Palestinian history, including, of course, 1948. We're seeing most of Gaza's infrastructure has been destroyed. 70% of Gaza's housing stock has been damaged or destroyed. We're seeing mass starvation and disease. 93% of Gaza's population is facing crisis levels of hunger and malnutrition. More than 500,000 are facing catastrophic conditions of hunger. This is an entirely man-made famine. We're seeing videos of mothers picking weeds to feed their children. It's really quite devastating. We're seeing wanton destruction. Schools, universities, hospitals, whole apartment blocks are being destroyed. Many of you may be seeing the videos of soldiers, in some cases gleefully destroying an entire university or apartment block. Sometimes even doing sort of as a gift to loved ones back home. Kind of the equivalent of snuff videos in the Israeli-Palestinian context. I think that Israel is using starvation and disease as a weapon is now indisputable. We of course we have the statements by Israeli officials, including the defense minister himself, who said that he's ordering a complete closure of food, electricity, fuel, and so forth. And Israel has been quite restrictive in what has been allowed. We're talking about, on average, about 3% of what was entering Gaza before October 7th is now being allowed in. And of course, we're seeing the effects of that. Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, and other groups have accused Israel of using starvation as a weapon of war. Save the Children, the World Food Program, Senator Van Hollen and his colleague, Senator Merkley, have come to the same conclusion, that this is based on a political decision by the Netanyahu government. In other words, it is not a consequence of war, but a deliberate act. We can talk about the specifics of that, but I think that's important. That's important to say. So it's hard for people to hear, but I think the conclusion that I've drawn and that many people are drawing, and probably the impetus for things like the South Africa genocide case, is that the mass suffering that we're seeing is in a very, very large measure deliberately created. I know that's hard to hear, but I think the evidence bears that out. So let's talk about the day after. I think in a very real sense, there is no day after, because one, we simply don't know where, when, or how this war ends, or what's left of Gaza, or what it looks like. Israel is waging an open-ended war. We may, in fact, never see a ceasefire, even if the intensity of this particular phase dies down or is diminished. We're going to see fighting on and off for quite a while, and I think that is also deliberate. I think the last thing Israel wants to do is arrive at a ceasefire, even in 3 months or 6 months, because it will mean that its two main objectives, destroying Hamas, that won't be achieved, right? You can't sign a ceasefire with someone who doesn't exist or who will no longer exist. So there's a kind of fundamental contradiction built in there. Um, the second, um, the second thing I would point out is that the scale of death and destruction and dislocation is just so massive that it's impossible to imagine at this stage what it would take to meet the immediate subsistence needs of the population, much less to think about how to make Gaza livable again. Whole sections of Gaza have been rendered unlivable. Again, this very much looks like a deliberate plan. We've seen bakeries bombed, we've seen universities bombed, we've seen infrastructure destroyed, we've seen agricultural crops destroyed. All of that seems to give the indication that Gaza is being purposely rendered unlivable. Um, so really, the best that we can do is not talk about a day after, but about a what now. What do we do now? What do Palestinians do? What does the international community do? What do the Arab states do? And that's where there is very, very little consensus. The American view of the so-called day after is very different than the Israeli view, and is also very different than the Palestinian view. So we have three or four, at least, very different visions of what should come next. And that will complicate things, even when the intensity of the fighting stops.
So can you talk about the Palestinian view? You mentioned that it's different from the US and Israeli one. What is it actually? What is it comprised of?
Well, the Palestinian view is, well, it depends on which Palestinians you ask. Officially, the view of Mahmoud Abbas and his leadership is that the PA does not want to go back to Gaza on the back of Israeli tanks. They cannot do that for their own domestic political reasons. They've resisted doing that in the past under much less devastating conditions, and they're not going to do that now. Um, uh, I think what they're saying is they are willing to go back, provided that there is sufficient international and especially financial support for rebuilding Gaza, and B, that the Gaza's reconstruction and the return of the PA be linked to a pathway toward a Palestinian state. And so that means what the Palestinians and the Arab states are now talking about are irreversible gestures on the part of Israel toward Palestinian statehood. That's a tall order, of course, given the composition of this government, or frankly, any conceivable Israeli government. That will be a very difficult thing to achieve, but that's the price that they're requesting.
Can you
Is
give a couple of examples of such irreversible gestures?
Well, the big one that the Palestinian Authority is seeking is recognition by the United States, by Western European powers, um, of a Palestinian state, and that I think they see that that would be a game changer. That would kind of bookmark a two-state solution. It would not radically change the situation on the ground, but it would demonstrate seriousness on the part of the United States and others to work toward that goal. Because you can't, even if I mean, I suppose anything is possible, but even if there were a change in administration, let's say a Trump administration, it would be very difficult to undo. I think, of course, that doesn't mean that he wouldn't undo it, but those are the kinds. Of course, nothing is everything is reversible theoretically, right? So they're looking for gestures that can be made, um, that would signify seriousness about a Palestinian state. Another thing that I can think of is again along the declarative lines would be something on Jerusalem. A statement to the effect that Jerusalem will be the capital of two states, or that Jerusalem will in fact be divided It's because the current U.S. policy is a bit of a contradiction, where everyone understands um, that there needs to be a Palestinian capital in Jerusalem, but Jerusalem should never be redivided, and those two things are incompatible. If you're going to have a sovereign Palestinian state with a capital, there needs to be a territorial division in Jerusalem. So that's one, that's another idea. Um, those things I think, are highly unlikely, um, at this stage.
So I'll go back. You said depending on which Palestinians you ask, right? When we talked about the day after, or the Palestinian thinking about the day after. Let's, if you may, if you'd like, talk a little bit about Hamas, about what is Hamas's vision. I don't know if long term, but looking forward. But also, and I see that we have a couple of questions about it already in the Q&A. Um, what was Hamas thinking? Why isn't Hamas uh, crying uncle? Why don't they surrender? Why don't they
Yeah.
seek a ceasefire?
Well, I mean, of course, Hamas has been calling for a ceasefire, just not one that involves their surrender. It's that is a I think it should be understood, although I'm not sure that it is. Part of the problem that we're in is that we're in this, ever since October 7th, we've been in this kind of zero sum frame of mind. Everything is absolute. Netanyahu and others in his coalition keep talking about the total dismantling of Hamas, and we will fight on and continue regardless. And that's maybe understandable from the standpoint of domestic consumption, but it's not realistic. So the goal of destroying Hamas was never a realistic one, and took almost 3 months for the Biden administration to finally climb down from that perch, even if the Israelis have not. So that's one thing. Hamas is not going to be destroyed, nor are they going to come out with, you won't see Yahya Sinwar waving the white flag, surrendering, because that's not what resistance movements do. He would rather die, and I think a lot of the people in leadership would rather kind of go down with the ship, die as heroes and martyrs rather than surrender, because the surrender is not just it wouldn't just be seen as the surrender of Hamas. It would be the capitulation of any and all resistance. So that's not going to happen. And even frankly, if it did, if Hamas said, okay, you know, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, they quit, well, you'd simply have new resistance movements that would emerge in the vacuum. And so
Because the idea of resistance, of an armed struggle, is very popular in the Palestinian arena, right?
Yeah, it's of course, because you have an armed occupation. And so when you have an occupation that is enforced militarily and that is maintained through brute force and coercion and violence, structural violence, well, then of course you're going to get armed resistance, and that armed resistance will be glorified and praised, and they're seen as heroes, in the same way, every national liberation movement uh, has gone through that, and so it's not reasonable to expect Palestinians to behave in ways that no other national liberation struggle would behave. If Hamas were to, as I said, if Hamas were to surrender, that would not just be a surrender of one organization. That would be essentially a surrender and a capitulation, and the surrender of all Palestinians. It would essentially mean, look, we lost. We are content to live as a lesser than people without rights indefinitely. And that's not going to happen. So it was never a reasonable, when I it's it's kind of upsetting when we keep hearing even someone who I think is quite reasonable, like Secretary Blinken, talking about, this could end tomorrow if Hamas surrenders. And I mean, come on. I mean, this is just not a realistic expectation. And so it was never on the table in the past. I mean, no one expected in the second Intifada that Hamas would, disband and disarm unilaterally and say, okay, yeah, we lost. You need to find an accommodation with armed groups in the political realm, right? They have political objectives, whether we like their methods or not. These are political groups with political objectives. Um, but the question of what was Hamas thinking, that's a question that I think people will be grappling with probably forever. I think a lot of us in the analyst community have the sense that, October 7th probably was, as an operation, was more successful, quote unquote, than they had imagined or originally set out. Don't think they were planning on this level of death and destruction in a single day. I think they had much more modest aims. It was still bold, obviously, but we don't know. Like we don't know what happened, or was it once the border fence was breached, and anyone could cross over. And so you had a bit of chaos. You had all kinds of armed and unarmed elements entering, through the fence. And so how much of the violence that we saw on October 7th, how much of it was planned, was under orders, and how much of it was chaos and unplanned? I don't have a good sense of that. But I imagine it's more than zero. Um, uh,
And I assume that as a result of that, because the Hamas's success was such, they probably also did not expect the strength of Israel's response.
right. I mean, I'm sure they expected a response, but you know, again, I don't know exactly what the plan was as it was drawn up, but if it was originally planned as to be focused much more on the military versus civilian targets, then we would have had a different response. They would have had, if let's say, they killed 200 soldiers and police and a dozen civilians and took back 20 hostages. I mean, I don't know that that was the plan, but I somewhere between that and what actually happened was the plan. But that would have elicited a very different response internationally, but also from Israel. It was the scale of civilian deaths and attacks and the brutality of it that elicited such a strong response. That said, we also don't know the full picture on the Israeli side. We know that that many of the deaths were inflicted by Israeli forces. We don't know how many, we don't know how wide it was, but that picture is also unclear. Maybe that will become clear over time. But regardless, we know that Hamas, or people who entered with Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other armed groups, carried out massacres of civilians, very, very hundreds and hundreds of civilians. So that much we know for certain. We may never know the exact motivation or what the exact plan was, but in its most basic form, the goal was to shatter to deliver a shock to the Israeli system and to shatter the sense of complacency that Israelis had kind of immersed themselves in, and the hubris and arrogance that went with it. And so, in that sense, it was very similar to almost exactly 50 years earlier, the surprise attack on October 6, 1973, where that was also designed to shock the Israelis out of this sense of, we were victorious in 6 days, and now we're masters of the region. Nobody can touch us, and we don't have to compromise. We don't have to think about diplomacy. So I think that was the kind of core objective, um,
So yeah, go
which
ahead. Go ahead.
happened, but it was different, right? It was a very different outcome than 1973.
Right, right. I want to relay a question that I've seen again in the Q&A. Several people related to it, and I know that it's relevant to the discussion that we're going to have in a few minutes. And that is the following question people are asking. Um, it's one shouldn't even be talking about ceasefire as it relates to Hamas, because Hamas does not want to cease fighting Israel because its goals, its ideology talks about the full destruction of the state of Israel. They don't want an accommodation, in other words. What they want is to continue fighting. How do you see that? Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, no, I have a different understanding of Hamas's mission and objectives. I don't think Hamas is waging a war of extermination or they're trying to destroy Israel. I think Hamas has reconciled itself long ago to the reality that Israel is a reality. Even if it's not something that they will accept morally, they accept it physically, and is as a political, military, physical reality, economic and otherwise. And people forget this, but the reality is that Hamas has accepted the concept, the principle of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and a capital in East Jerusalem. Um, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, his successor, Rantisi, and virtually every leader of Hamas since then has affirmed their acceptance of that principle within the Palestinian political consensus, right? So there are the bases of Palestinian consensus of the PLO, and even though Hamas is not part of the PLO formally, they have adopted or they've accepted the basic pillars of end to Israeli occupation, a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, capital in Jerusalem, right of return for the refugees, and so on and so forth. These are matters of political consensus across the Palestinian factions, and Hamas is part of that. I don't. But there's another reason why I don't believe Hamas is engaged in that. We don't have to take them at their word. I think as a matter of political relevance, as a matter of political pragmatism, if their goal is to rule, is to be, the number one political, the leaders of the Palestinian national movement, they're not going to do that if their goal is to liberate from the river to the sea, right? They're not going to preside over a Palestinian state from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. If that's their goal, then they're never going to rule. And that's not their goal. Their goal is to be politically relevant. Now, if Palestinian public opinion shifts, and it is shifting against the two-state solution, but it hasn't shifted toward anything concrete, like a one-state solution that's been fleshed out and has a political constituency and has a vision and strategy and a kind of ideological coherence that hasn't emerged yet. But if that were to happen, then sure, Hamas and maybe even Fatah as well could evolve in that direction. But for now, I think Hamas absolutely would accept and is probably hoping for a diplomatic process that would eventually lead to a genuine creation of a Palestinian state from their standpoint, minus the recognition of Israel, right? That can be Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas, and they can recognize Israel. But from their standpoint, morally, that's not something that they will that they would concede. But I do think they would concede and live within a two-state solution de facto.
Now, you know that many people are saying, okay, this is something that we would have believed on October 6th, but after October 7th, we can't accept this because they've just proven the contrary. Um, but you do still think that they are pragmatic enough to to seek some kind of accommodation.
I do. I mean, look, we have to distinguish between extremist methods and extremist goals. And sometimes groups have both, have extremist methods and extremist goals. Sometimes groups have very reasonable goals but extremist methods. Um, uh, so I think that's the case here with Hamas. I think Hamas, since since the Second Intifada, but particularly since 2006 when it won a surprise election victory, I think they've been struggling to kind of find the right balance. You know, how do we maintain our resistance credentials and our identity as the resistance group, as distinct from Fatah and their very accommodationist approach, and at the same time, you know, they want international legitimacy. They want to be accepted as a normal political party and movement within the Palestinian landscape, right? They have a diplomatic, you know, the strategy. They've had one, and so they've tried different approaches. They tried running in elections, which they had previously opposed. They tried say, okay, you know, we'll join the PLO. We'll be part of that framework. That didn't work. They modified their charter. They distanced themselves from the Muslim Brotherhood, mainly to accommodate the Sisi regime, which obviously in Gaza they had to have a good working relationship with. So they would make all these kind of pragmatic gestures. Meanwhile, you had this more militant wing within Hamas, like all factions, like all movements, there are different factions. There are moderates, there are militants, there are extremists, and the more militant and extreme faction was always there, saying all that stuff that will get you nowhere. It's only force, violence, and armed struggle that will achieve results. And conditions eventually bore that out, where all of where you know, there was consistently these dead ends, right? There was they even got to a point where they were being perceived as, you know, the PA is the security contractor in the north, and Hamas was now the security contractor in the south, almost replicating the same kind of dynamic. They would prevent people from firing rockets, you know, other groups from firing rockets at Israel because they didn't want to disrupt the status quo that was, you know, somewhat, you know, bearable and useful for them while they bided their time. So they had tried all these different avenues, um, and everywhere was a dead end. And so the militant, you know, this is my interpretation. This isn't like, again, I don't have inside information, but you know, over time, the militant wing got stronger and stronger, and they said, "Look, all you guys tried, you know, your political, diplomatic, pragmatic efforts, and they didn't work. We need to deliver a significant blow." And so they came out on top, but I don't think it was inevitable. I think lots of things would have and could have avoided October 7th. I think about sometimes what if Palestinians held elections in 2021 as originally scheduled? And Hamas might have been fully integrated into the body politic, maybe joined the PLO formally, maybe, you know, Israel wouldn't have liked it, but they would have acquiesced in it on some level. The Americans would have, you know, something similar. Um, that could have avoided October 7th. Lots of things could have avoided October 7th, including Palestinian reconciliation. You know, many of us have been saying for a long time this division is not only bad for Palestinians, it's destabilizing and it's dangerous, and it will backfire. And it's only a matter of time before it explodes. And of course, it did. So now everybody understands. Well, the PA has to come back. Well, the PA can only come back as a matter of internal Palestinian consensus. If Hamas doesn't approve of the PA going back, the PA will not go back, whether or not Hamas is still in control in Gaza. That's just a it's not necessarily a military reality, but it is a political reality.
So let me ask you about that. I was intending originally to get to it later, but since you referred to it in the article that I mentioned earlier, you write, and I quote, "It is extremely difficult to see a way forward for Palestinian politics with Hamas, but equally, there is no way forward without it." Now, I think most of our listeners, our viewers, would probably understand what you mean by the first part of that statement, of that assertion. But what about the second one? Could you explain why Hamas is necessary for Palestinian politics to function? Isn't there a way for Hamas to cease being a political player in the Palestinian arena?
So it's a good question. It's not about Hamas being necessary for Palestinian politics to function. Or to exist. It's about the fact that it exists, right? Hamas exists, and Israel won't bomb it out of existence. That's just not an achievable goal. This is a movement. It has support in the West Bank, Jerusalem, not just in Gaza. You certainly can't kill everyone who sympathizes with or supports Hamas. So that's just not feasible. Um, so it will continue to exist. And so if it exists, in what form does it exist? Does it capture 1% of the, public support, 20%, 50%? Um, it, it's it it's clearly at least the second most influential Palestinian political faction. At this point, it may be the most popular. I think after October 7th, it has grown in its popularity. I think a lot of people, are there's enormous support for Hamas everywhere, inside and outside of Palestine, but particularly inside. It's hard to know exactly what people in Gaza are thinking because they're in survival mode. They're just trying to stay alive and keep their families alive. They're not really thinking about politics as such. So the question is, if we know Hamas exists and we know it has a significant following, well, then what do you do with it? Do you do you do what we've done the past 30 years and pretend that it doesn't exist and just try to exclude it not only from a peace process but from internal Palestinian politics? That doesn't seem reasonable, or tenable, and that is very destabilizing because that's what got us into this mess, in very large part. So um, it and then there's a question of who gets to decide, right? I mean, who gets to be a political actor in someone else's politics? The answer should be Palestinians get to decide. How? So let's say there's an election, okay? Not now, but let's say in a few years when it becomes feasible to hold an election, uh, should Hamas be allowed to participate? uh, Israel and the United States probably, and some, the UK and others might say absolutely not. Hamas has disqualified itself from ever being a legitimate political actor. Okay, well, you can exclude a major political actor from elections, but will those elections be legitimate? Probably not. They will not be seen as legitimate. So that's the conundrum, is if you exclude Hamas, you have an illegitimate outcome. If you include them, there are also risks, but I think the risks are much more manageable because then Hamas is part of the political process. They have a stake in Palestinian politics, in Palestinian political institutions, even as an opposition movement. And so, yes, that would complicate greatly future negotiations, because now you have Hamas, an opposition group. They could veto um, the whole process, right? They could, but they're doing it in a way that would be through politics, through negotiations or internal politics. Um, and that's the norm, right? You can't pretend that they don't exist. In the same way that how many Israeli prime ministers have said, I can't talk about those things because there's these guys behind me in the opposition who will have my head if I talk about dividing Jerusalem and all, settlement freeze or all of these things. And so, yes, it complicates the negotiation process, but it also makes it the outcome much more durable because now Hamas is bought into the game. They have a stake in the success of the process that they're a part of. And so no one is saying that Israel has to negotiate with Hamas directly, but Hamas should be part of the political landscape, um, either as an opposition or perhaps someday they may be the dominant force. If they are the dominant force in Palestinian politics, then it still makes sense because at the end of the day, you don't negotiate peace with your friends. You negotiate with your enemies, people who've done terrible things to you and that you have frankly also done terrible things to. Inducing mass starvation in Gaza is not a nice thing to do. And so there's deep, deep, deep trauma that will be generational for Palestinians coming out of this. And in the same way that Israelis suffered trauma on October 7th and are suffering trauma because of the hostages. That's why you have peace processes. That's why you have negotiations, is to reconcile these two sides that have done terrible things to each other. It doesn't make sense to exclude them otherwise, because then they will always play the role of a spoiler as they've done. So to me, it's just not logical to exclude them. You have to take the good with the bad.
Before we get to the next questions, I just wanted to take a moment and relate to some of the questions that have been asked here. Many of them are vexing questions that tell me that people are not quite happy with what they're hearing. Um, some of those questions have to do with facts, with facts that relate to the past. I'm thinking that maybe in a column or something, sometime soon, I will address some of those because it is important to talk about things like the positions, the historic positions of Hamas, and I think that Khaled has depicted them correctly. Um, other other questions are just vexing questions that are trying to pick a fight, and I'm not going to relay them to Khalid.
Maybe
So I'm
it's good
looking
that I
for
can't see the questions.
I'm looking for ones that are more a matter of just seeking facts. Uh, and one of them that I just saw a moment ago here, and I wanted to relate to you is what could make the PA a viable representative of the Palestinians, and could um, the recognition of a role for Hamas, as you pointed out, serve that goal?
Um, so here's the thing. There's two different political entities that Palestinians have. One is the Palestinian Authority and the other is the PLO. My own view, and I think the view of a lot of Palestinians, maybe most Palestinians, is that the PA is not the political address. It's not the proper place to be the political address of the Palestinian national movement. Historically, that has been the PLO. The PA was supposed to be a vehicle toward, initially self-governing and then eventually would graduate to a state. And then both the PA and the PLO would be merged into that state. But that never happened. And so the PA was kind of frozen in its development. And is at this point, I think it operates as a kind of glorified municipal authority. Um, so there's a difference between governance and leadership. What Palestinians need now, I mean, Gaza needs governance and aid and rehabilitation and so forth. So you need a governance body. That body should be depoliticized, in my view, as much as possible. It should not be the representative of the Palestinian people because the Palestinian people are not located only in the West Bank and Gaza. They are in the diaspora as well, and they are a constituency that have a stake in the outcome. Um, so my own view is to sort of downgrade the PA to a technical body that does service provision and can also be responsible or oversee Gaza's reconstruction, but operates in both the West Bank and Gaza under the political guidance of a revamped PLO, which would be inclusive and genuinely representative. So historically, the PLO was was a representative body. I mean, it represented people inside the occupied territories, in the refugee camps, in the diaspora in general. It included all the political factions. That ceased to be true after the late 1980s. Hasn't been true since Hamas's creation. The fact that Hamas and other groups have been outside the PLO has denied the PLO that legitimacy that it used to enjoy. So we're talking about two different institutions here. I think it's much more important for Palestinians to have a political leadership that is representative and that is legitimate. And that should be vested in the PLO, in a revamped, reconstituted PLO. The PA is a different matter. There may never be a Palestinian state, and so um, that needs to be something that people grapple with as a matter of reality. So if there is no future for a two-state solution, then again, you still have a political leadership in the form of the PLO that is not tied to some imaginary two-state solution like the PA, right? So the PA could exist or could not exist. The Palestinian national movement should not be, and Palestinian leadership should not be a function of whether or not there is or isn't a two-state solution around the corner. And I think Palestinians have suffered because of a lack of political leadership. And so it's a complex situation.
Yeah, yeah, and again, you relate to it in the article that you've written. I can't at the moment put the link to the article in the chat, but if people go and Google it, it'll come up. It was in foreign policy. Um,
Foreign affairs.
Foreign affairs, sorry, foreign affairs, that's it. Um, I wanted to ask you a question that is controversial. It may even be provocative, but it has to do with something that you mentioned earlier, and that is how um, the events that have unfolded after October 7th on the Palestinian arena evoke the founding Palestinian trauma, which is the Nakba. By the way, for Israelis, October 7th also evoked a trauma, which is the Holocaust, and we've seen many, many references to that. My question has to do with what, for Palestinians, is the most dominant characteristic of the Nakba, which is dispossession. Um, and so I fully understand why Palestinians and others would be opposed, vehemently opposed um, to relocation of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. But bear with me for a question that is not that tries to find a way to do it that is not dispossession, and that is the following. Um, Most of Gaza's residents are refugees. They're descendants of refugees or refugees themselves who do not consider Gaza as their permanent home, but rather a temporary home. Um, would it be possible at all to have Gazans temporarily settle in the West Bank or maybe somewhere else? But I think in the West Bank, which is the other lobe of the Palestinian political entity, at least temporarily, while Gaza is being rebuilt, so that there's a little bit of kind of a pause, if you will, in the civil efforts to rebuild Gaza. Is that something that could happen? And I'm not talking at the moment about possible Israeli objection, which I think will be there, but let's just suppose for a moment that that's not going to be an impediment.
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult issue because anytime you're talking about relocating Palestinians, it brings up that old trauma. And I mean, look, I think the West Bank is at least a better option than the Sinai. Um, but history has shown, regardless, um, that anytime large numbers of Palestinians have been uprooted and forced out of their homes and land, they've not been allowed to return. So there's no precedent really for any significant return. The only, there was the returnees during the Oslo process after 1993, and those were, I forget exactly how many thousand, but um, there's no precedent other than that, and that was in the context of returning police forces and things like that. Um, so realistically, it's hard to imagine, particularly if they were displaced outside of Palestine, that they would ever be allowed to return. I think that's where the resistance to the idea comes from. I think the question is a couple questions. One, if Gaza has been rendered unlivable, why has it been rendered unlivable? And shouldn't the solution be to stop rendering it unlivable and to even start compelling Israel to pay the costs for the problems that it's created, right? I mean, these are, one of my great frustrations is people tend to treat Israel and its actions as though it were a kind of meteorological event. It's just how it is. You have to brace yourself, you bring an umbrella, but you can't stop it. Um, and we're forgetting that there are choices. Israel's making choices. Israel's making a choice to dislocate 90% of the population. It is making a choice to deny food and water and fuel. It is making a choice to bomb densely populated civilian areas with the most powerful bombs ever created. Those are choices. Those are not inevitable. They're not inevitabilities. And so Israel can make different choices. People can make choices to compel Israel to make different choices. I think if Israel believed that it would have to pay the price for making Gaza unlivable, it might think twice about doing so. Um, and so what concerns me, and I think what would concern a lot of Palestinians, is the precedent that this would set. Um, and so, I mean, first of all, I don't know where you put 2 million people in the West Bank.
Yeah.
Uh, you know,
Well, not
you
2 million. Let's say several, I don't know, couple 100,000, 300, 4. I'm throwing a number.
okay, okay, a couple of 100,000, okay, but sure, maybe the West Bank can hold some, but why not Israel? Why isn't Israel also part of the question? Is, well, why can't they be temporarily be relocated to Israel? There's a lot of space in the Negev. They could build housing, temporary housing. And after all, Israel did create this problem. Israel did give these people orders to evacuate, and they destroyed their homes. Um, and so I think what people find objectionable is this idea that Israel will create this human and humanitarian catastrophe, and then others will pick up the tab and pay and clean up the mess, whether it's the PA or the Saudis or the Egyptians or whoever. But they're not even really thinking about the day after, right? They're not particularly concerned with where they end up or go or don't go, or if they have homes or they don't have homes. This is one of the frustrations of the Biden administration, is they have not given any real thought to what happens next, even though it has enormous consequences even for them. Um, so if you could change that calculation, then why not? If you could change Israel's calculation that not everything is, a mess that other people have to clean up. Um, yeah.
Yeah. So we have 3 minutes left, and I'm counting the questions that we have here. There's 63 questions, and I have some questions of my own, but we really don't have the time to entertain them all. Maybe to end, I will just ask you if you could think of three main things that should happen immediately in order to let's say alleviate the dire situation that we're in. What would you say? What would be it can be more than three, but just a few things that can be done immediately now.
I think a ceasefire is absolutely the first one, and maybe one, two, and three. I mean, it's nothing is more important than ending the damage that's being done. Some of which, most of which, part of which is irreversible. And so the first step is to stop doing more damage. Um, the continued bombing, this same dynamic could go on for months with very little impact on Hamas. And the real impact is on the Palestinian people in Gaza. The running joke now, which of course is not at all funny, but that Israel is fighting a war against Palestinian civilians and that Hamas is the collateral damage. Occasionally they do some damage to Hamas, but there is no good that can come out of continuing even for another day what is happening now. There is only degrees of disaster. So that's number one. I think number two would be for Palestinians to put their internal house in order. It's precisely in this kind of moment when Palestinians have a weak and not very credible leadership that bad things happen to them. That was true in 1948. That is true now. It's having a credible leadership is not a failsafe against annihilation and catastrophe, but it's impossible to confront what is a real existential threat to Palestinians without a credible leadership. So this has been absolutely catastrophic. This lack of political leadership. So whatever that takes, revamping the PLO, a succession process for post Abu Mazen. A lot of people are talking about, Marwan Barghouti as a kind of unifying figure. That's for Palestinians to decide, but that needs to happen immediately. And then the third thing is for the United States and the international community to lay out a very clear process for ending it, not just a pathway to a Palestinian state, but for deoccupation and decolonization. Those are dynamics that have to be begun on the ground with actual steps. So not just freezing settlements, rolling back settlements, not just, I mean, concrete steps uh, toward dealing with the driver of this conflict, which is Israel's occupation and the repression and violence that goes with it. Those are the most important three things, and they're everything. It's like it's not I don't actually see anything else beyond those three.
Khaled, thank you very much. This was truly eye-opening. I know that some people, as we can tell by the Q&A, I referred to it earlier. I'm not going to go into it. Just reminding everyone that this is recorded. You can then view the video on our YouTube channel. You can listen to the audio on our podcast. And just reminding everyone of the webinar we're going to have next Tuesday with Rabbi Sharon Brous. Khaled, thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.